All right, welcome to this lesson. And in this lesson, we will be creating our services. So we just got done creating our repositories, and now we will use these repositories inside of our services. So let's get started doing that. You will need to create a new class. And we will be putting this new class into a new package called service. So our service package. So here we will be doing similarly what we did with the repositories, but these are going to be services. So with our naming conventions, we'll start off with trip again. We'll do trip service. So we don't need to add any interfaces here. We just do trip service. And now our services are going to be what pretty much does most of the logic. These are extensions of our controller. So our controller will be using these services to handle the logic. So all we want to be able to do for each one of these models is create, read, update, and delete our basic CRUD operations. So we will start off by using our auto wiring. So auto wiring is basically nothing but dependency injection. This is what I explained in the intro. The dependency injection just it loosely couples our classes together. So basically, instead of saying trip repository trip repo equals new trip repository. All right, so instead of doing this and creating a new repository, we will actually be injecting this repository bean into this class. Remember, beans are instantiated at runtime. So we have one bean that's instantiated and put into the Spring container. So what we will be doing is asking the Spring container to give us that bean, which is a trip repository bean. All right. And so when we go back to our repository, this is where, when we wrote this at repository, this is where we are telling Spring to make a bean out of this. So we say, hey, we want this class to be a bean. So put this class into the Spring container. This is how we're telling it to do that. It's going, the application, we're using the application context will put this bean into the the Spring container. So we have this trip repo. Instead of doing this new, we will just take it here. We will still be declaring it, but not in the same way. We will have to put this annotation here at auto wired, and you import that. And this tells Spring, hey, we want to use that bean in this class. So we created the bean by using this, and we are getting the bean by using this auto wired. So now all we have to do is create our CRUD methods. So we will make these public, and then we will, for the create method, we will be returning the object we just created. So we need to tell it to return a trip, and then we will have create. So this create method, let me import this trip object. All right. Inside of this class here, what we will want to do is to write the code to create this trip. So we want to persist this trip into our database. The way we do this is by utilizing this trip repo here. This trip repo extends our JPA repository interface. Now this interface allows us to call specific methods that Spring provides to us. So here we will be able to call the save method to create our trip in our database. So the way we do this is, first things first, we need to make sure that we are saving a new trip. The way we do this is by ensuring that this trip here does not have an ID, because when you call the save method of the JPA repository class, it will save that object according to its ID. So if there is an ID present, then it's going to overwrite whatever information is in that table entry. So what we want to do is ensure that this trip does not have an ID, so we can make sure that we're creating a new entry in our database. So how we're going to do this is we're going to take this trip, then we're going to say set ID, and then we're going to set it to 0. So setting this to 0 ensures that we have that this will create a new entry into our database and give it a new ID. All right, once we do that, we want to actually use this trip repo to save our database entry, which is this trip object here. So what we would do is we would call trip repo dot save, and then we would pass in this trip object. So this saves our trip object into our database. Now this save method also returns a trip, as you can see here. So what we would do is return that saved object so we can get it back from the method that called this. So we will return the trip repo.save. So this is doing two things here. It's saving saving this trip into the database, and it's also returning the saved trip. So that will create our new entry, database entry, and it will return it. So next, we will want to do a read. So public trip read. And to do a read, all we would need is the ID, because we're getting the whole database entry, and we can grab it by getting the ID. So all we need to do is pass in an integer here, and that is the ID. And then we can call trip repo dot find by ID and pass in the ID. So this find by ID method is another method that is provided by Spring, same as this save method, because as you can see back in our trip repository, we didn't write any methods here. So where is that method coming from? It is coming from this JPA repository. So this JPA repository class is giving us the save method. So this method here, and it is also giving us this find by ID method, which is here. So that's where these methods are coming from, and this is giving us our error because we are not returning this trip. So when we do find by ID, this method does not just return a trip as the save method does. See how the save method just returns a trip? But if you look at this find by ID method, we're returning an optional trip. So what is an optional? An optional class in Java is a wrapper class. It's just a container class that helps facilitate null checks. So basically, if we can't find an entry with this ID, instead of returning null, what they would do is return this optional object with a null inside. So if there is an entry found with the ID, it will return an optional with a trip inside. However, if there is no entry with that ID, then it will return an optional with a null inside. So that basically helps with null checking. So you can say you can call a method from the optional class that is called isPresent. So if you call isPresent and it is there, then it will return true. If you call isPresent and it is null, then it will return false. So it helps with null checking. So what we will do is set up an optional here that holds a trip, because that's what this trip repo returns. It returns trips. So we will have an optional that holds a trip, and we will call this optional. And then make sure you import optional. Comes from Java util optional. So import that. Now that we have this optional object, we can return it. We can return the trip that is inside of it. So the way we will do this is we will utilize optional's get method. So the optional, as I said earlier, is holding this trip object. So we use optional.get to get that object out of the optional. So here we want to return a trip. So the way we would do this is we will say return optional.get. So when we return optional.get, it will return this trip because this optional is holding a trip object. So we say optional.get and it will return us a trip object. So this is how we will read from our database. This is how we save to our database using this. And then we will read from our database using this. As far as updates go, it's going to be really similar to the save method. The only difference is we are not going to be setting the ID to 0 because we want to update the trip that is passed in. So we will call public trip update. Then we'll pass in a trip. So here we would do the exact same thing as create, but without setting the ID. So we say save. Oh my goodness, what is going on here? Save trip. All right. So this will save the trip as it is with whichever ID is passed in with this trip. And then we are returning the trip here. So that is our update method. Very simple. Now, I know somebody's probably asking, well, why, if they're the same and all we're doing is setting the ID to 0, why can't we just combine these, just have them as one method, like a save method? We could do that and just make sure that when it's passed in, it doesn't matter, because if it's a new one, then it will have an ID of 0, and if it's not, then it will save it where it's at. And that is something you can do. I've seen people do that, have the update and the create method as the same method. I just like to separate mine out to ensure that when I call create, we are getting a new entry into the table. So it's just up to your preference. I would prefer and I would recommend that you split them, but you can do whatever you want. It's your application. All right, last but not least is the delete method, which is also pretty simple. Here we will not be returning anything because we can't return a deleted entry into the database. So what we will do is we will call this method delete. Delete. And then we will pass in an ID. All right. And then we will call trip repo.delete. And we pass in an ID. Oh, is there not a delete by ID? So delete by ID, and we pass in the ID, and there we go. This is our trip service, and our trip service is now complete. So there's one other thing we must do, and that is for Spring Boot to know that this is a bean as well. So when we used the model, we did at entity. When we did the repository, we did at repository. So when we do a service, we do at service. All right, and there we go. Once you annotate this Spring will recognize this as a bean. And we want it to recognize this class as a bean. All right, so this is one service down, and the other services are exactly the same, except these will change. So obviously in a ticket service, we will not be returning a trip, but it's the exact same layout. So let's go ahead and get it done. All right, now that we have that done, all we have to do now is add our service annotation at the top, and there we go. Now we have the same service for a ticket. So same thing, create a ticket, return a ticket, read a ticket, return the ticket from the optional as before, and save the ticket for in an update and delete the ticket. All right, so that works for that. Now save, and let's create our last service for the customer. All right, now that's done, once again, add your service annotation, import it, and that's it. All right, so now we have our 3 services done. This is all for this lesson. Next up, we would do our controllers. We're pretty much done writing our code. So I'll see you guys in the next one.